All right, so everybody's out there taking down monuments and wanting to rewrite history, and we're still singing Hamilton show tunes around here. So tonight's episode of Parenting Porcupines is going to be about all those buzzwords and how much input or impact do we really have on what our kids are learning in school as far as history is concerned. We are the Libertarian Moms, and this is Parenting Porcupines. Let's do it. So we've done cancel culture before, and we've done some of these sort of buzzword topic things before, but this one kind of came out of nowhere. We were talking about doing the founding fatherhood around Independence Day and talking about what does it look like to talk to your kids about the original founding fathers and sort of understanding them as real men, and the kind of history that versus what we've been taught. Are they immortal, or were they human beings? So we're going to talk a little bit about that and where it comes from. I'm going to let Jessica tell the story about how she and I met. But then it kind of veers off. And if you're following the show notes out there on our parentingporcupines.com, let me put that banner up here so you can go out there and find it. Then you'll know that this topic actually gets into something that's really kind of hitting the airwaves right now, which is this idea of rewriting history and whether or not our historians and our history teachers have a right to do that, and whether or not we should encourage it or discourage it. So we'll see which side of the argument we come down on this in either way. But Jessica, why don't you get us started with our Hamilton story?
So Casey, Melissa, and I, all three were national delegates to the 2020 Libertarian National Convention. So in our preparation for this convention, Casey and I decided that we were going to ride down to Orlando together. And we were going to share the hotel room, so that, save some expense and whatnot. And it was an 8-hour drive. Mm-hmm. So about an 8-hour drive. And so we were just talking about mom stuff. And Casey mentioned Hamilton. And I was like, yeah, Hamilton. And so we realized that we both have this unhealthy obsession with Hamilton.
You see it? There it is. Hanging on the wall.
Yeah. And so the idea came up, when we started talking about doing Parenting Porcupines, and it all was born out of our trip to that convention. One of the ideas that we had was talking about the founding fathers and how you have to take the bad with the good, that you can't rewrite history, and some other things that we're going to talk about later in the episode. So that's how Casey and I bonded. We bonded over Hamilton and motherhood.
So the conversation that Hamilton broke open, Hamilton being the stage play, the Broadway play that then was put up on Disney Plus. So those of you who are like, if you're living in a cave and you don't know what Hamilton is, that's what Hamilton is. It's a musical. And they cast a lot of non-white actors into a lot of these traditionally white roles. So we have Christopher Jackson playing George Washington. And if you don't know who Christopher Jackson is, go ahead and Google him. He's a Black man, right? I watched Hamilton so many times on Disney Plus that I honestly believe when I pick up a quarter, I'm going to see Christopher Jackson's face on it. Like, I really, truly believe that he is George Washington. So there's this sense that when Hamilton did that, when Lin-Manuel Miranda and the others that put that show together intentionally cast persons of color in these traditionally white roles, what they were saying was, in the theater, we have an opportunity to make our story belong to everybody. It doesn't have to be historically accurate. It doesn't have to be people that look like them. It can be people who are interpreting the story. And I thought that was a really powerful message. Like, on our side, at least in our house, what we talked about was, of course, we now have an opportunity to bring this story that has felt maybe distant from people that didn't really resonate with them. It became a lot more immediate for them. And it wasn't even just the characters or the actors that were cast. It was also in the music, because hip hop music was used in the play as well. And so, which is a traditionally African-American music genre, right? And so we get this sense that they're bringing this sort of old, antiquated story of the founding fathers, and they're putting it into these more modern terms. And we loved everything about it. I mean, I think it's the single greatest piece of art I've ever witnessed in my life.
Absolutely.
Hands down.
100%.
But what did you say though? So you've seen it too, Melissa. What did you say when somebody says to you, but it's not real, it's not true?
I don't understand the question. What do you mean? Of course it's not. What do you mean it's not real? It's a play.
Of course it's not true.
But
it's not a biography. It's a Broadway show.
It's a play. It's an interpretation. You know, they're not saying he invented the internet. Like it's as far as I know, historically accurate. The events took place, the marriage took place, the events of the war, the correspondence. Like, okay, it's based on actual facts with some interpretation. But see, I don't know if I just had an awesome history teacher. Everything you read is interpretation. Unless you're reading the stuff written by the founding fathers, everything you learn in history class is someone's interpretation of what's important and what happened. They look at the records and say, okay, well, this is the part of the story I'm going to tell. He just focused on the part he wanted to tell.
Yeah.
That doesn't make it wrong. It's just different.
And I think what's so interesting about Hamilton, and we're not going to live in Hamilton forever, guys. So
we are going to get into the bigger conversations.
But I think the thing about Hamilton, that one of the things that we talked about that was so fascinating is how it really made people think about the founding fathers and what it was that they did in establishing our nation and financial systems, our judicial system. I mean, that was huge, right? I mean, that was a big accomplishment, but they made it in a way so that it made people more curious about not just these characters, but the men themselves. And so I think it gave the opportunity to have some of those discussions about the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Right. And I think that to both of your points. So history is curated, and it's curated by the people who tell the stories. Right. And so for so long, by the winner. Exactly. For so long, those stories have been told by a specific segment of our population, right? Historically, those stories have been told by white men. And so there's pieces that are being left out, pieces that they didn't see as being relevant or important simply because they weren't part of their own experience. And so now what we have is this kind of movement toward bringing all these other voices in and looking at other source material and finding slave narratives and finding, anything and everything that will break open those stories just a little bit wider and show what the experience looked like for different looking people, for different kinds of people in different economic circumstances. So I don't think of it as rewriting history when we ask our schools to be transparent about what they're teaching, or when we question the legitimacy of the textbooks that they're using. I instead think of it as trying to break open the narrative and get a better view of a 365-degree view, in as much as we can, of what actually happened. Isn't that more authentic? Doesn't that make it a little bit more true-ish?
I would think so.
Oh, so now the episode's over. That's it. That's all we need.
We agree. Awesome.
We all agree.
Problem solved.
Big surprise. Here we are in our propaganda machine telling you. Putting forward what the libertarians think of rewriting history. We're all for it. Make it happen. So the show notes are out on the blog. I put the link up there just a second ago. It's parentingporcupines.com. Of course, we start out with our concept of Hamilton, but there's a couple of accomplishments. I thought this was interesting, Jessica, that you mentioned that our founding fathers were able to do that we don't necessarily think about. And the first one you put in there was built an army and defeated the world's biggest superpower. So talk about like overcoming these enormous odds. What kind of lesson is that for our kids now and for Americans now learning that particular story?
I think it's important because it speaks to the original the character of our country, how it was established. Yeah. I mean, you take a bunch of farmers and you can do, I mean, it's like this, the epitome of you can do anything you set your mind to. Right.
We went camping last week. We went up to Kings Mountain, and then we visited Kings Mountain Battle Site, Cowpens Battle Site in Brattonsville. And we're walking around and reading these plaques about Revolutionary War battles. And I'm trying to explain to my kids, now they're what, 6, 8, and 11. And I'm like, and because it turned the entire tide of the war. We started winning and Charleston had fallen. They had taken the whole state. We finally start winning up here in the upstate. I'm like, but you don't understand. It's the Army of England, like the professional military of England versus, your dad and a couple of his buddies. Called him up on the phone and said, meet me here. We're going to go kick some ass.
Yeah.
And they did. I'm like, it wasn't our army versus their army. It's our farmers versus their army, which is why this is such a big deal that we won. And they're just, oh, okay. But I'm like, I'm trying to explain to them that this is not, we didn't have an army fighting these battles. These are the farmers and the dudes that live there defending their property against the actual army of the biggest country in the world.
Against paid soldiers, right?
Yeah.
And what we've seen,
trained guys with better weapons, better leadership, better everything.
This is where my libertarian's going to come in. What we've seen again and again and again is that when paid soldiers go into a theater of war against people who are fighting to protect their way of life and their homeland, they lose. Right. And so what we know of some of these battles that we've now had to sustain 20 years in Afghanistan, right? What we know is that despite having the greatest military history of the world, right, and currently on the planet, we struggled in Afghanistan for 20 years against a population that was just desperate to maintain their own liberty and their own freedom and live their lives in their own way. And I'm not in any way to disparage our soldiers who have been career military people, because of course we support them always, but just to remember that as early as the American Revolution, and that's not even the first time we saw this, we've been taught that. That's the lesson of history, right? But that's not the lesson we've been
something to fight for.
But that's not the lesson we've been learning. We've been learning like Americans are superior. We're getting American exceptionalism out of our textbooks, and that's when we get to that piece of this rewriting history thing, we'll talk a little bit about that. All right, the other thing you said that our founding fathers did that we maybe don't necessarily notice is they created this new financial system and created a society that allowed for financial prosperity with liberty, right? You didn't have to be born into wealth. You were able to earn that. So talk a little about that and how that's sort of fallen out of our historical vocabulary.
Where do I start? I mean, where do we start? We live in a society that thinks that government has to be the root of everything. They dictate how businesses and industries can operate. They can dictate
what you're paid,
what
your rent will be,
you can get,
where you can live,
how you can make a living.
Yeah.
Whether or not you're qualified to make a living at the trade that you've decided to pursue.
Yeah. So, and that wasn't the case then. When they were building this new nation, they built it on the idea that every person should be able to be responsible for their own future, and they should be able to build their future.
Equal.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah,
so,
and have the right to pursue happiness and the right to prosperity. Yeah,
that's not that you have the right to it. You have the right to pursue it.
Right. So. And then the last one that you put here I thought was really interesting too was this complex legal system for fair and equitable justice. And once again, this goes back to where the founding fathers came from in a way that people that had money could buy their justice for themselves. And that's not the system they set up for us. That's not the way it was supposed to be. Have we fallen? Have our financial systems, have our legal and justice systems, have they fallen away from those original intentions, do you think? There's like whispers.
Absolutely. Yes.
Yes, they have.
Well, when the government is picking winners and losers, depending on how much you donate to their candidates.
Yeah. When certain families,
Walmart can absorb a $20 an hour minimum wage.
Mm-hmm.
My office can't.
Yeah.
Right.
Because.
Yeah. Or the the legal systems. I'll be delicate, but there are certain families that can buy their way into all of those things and buy their way out of trouble.
Yep. The tax
Buy their way
system.
out of trouble.
Everybody complains that Amazon and Jeff Bezos doesn't pay enough taxes. They're legally using the system.
Yeah.
They can just afford to hire the people to figure out how to use the system.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I can't hire someone. I don't have that kind of money, but they
Yeah,
have that kind of money, so they can figure out how to get through the system.
They're operating within the system that was created intentionally to benefit them. And why wouldn't they? Right? I mean, it doesn't make them bad people. It makes them like all the rest of us. We would do it too if we could, right?
I try and pay as few taxes as possible.
We absolutely do as well.
Preferably.
Because it's theft. All right. And so let's do this. So now that's what we were talking about at the beginning of the show notes. Again, it's out there on parentingporcupines.com, talking about these amazing founding father men, right? These people that built the system, right? Or at least architects of it in the initial. And yet we know they're imperfect. Washington and Jefferson are slave owners. They amassed great wealth and privilege, right? Jefferson and Hamilton were adulterers. So we know that about them. Jefferson actually started, Jessica put this in her entire family with his slaves. And I added a note in here, a link in here to the Words and Numbers episode where James and Anthony talk about Thomas Jefferson. Yeah. So there's a lot of, and I put it in bold, do not read this as an endorsement of enslaving people. That's not what this is. But they talk about the financial incompatibilities between what we think Jefferson should have done and what Jefferson was actually empowered to do.
It was illegal. He would have been thrown in jail. And my first thought was, okay, so he frees all the slaves. What do? Can they read? Can they write? Can they get a job and not starve? Probably not.
Right.
So you can't just be like, okay, you're on your own now. What are they going to do? There's got to be a mechanism to go from point A to point B, and just sending them on their way does not accomplish that.
Once again, not to explain away or make it better that there are enslaved people living at Monticello, but thinking about if you are building a community and you're trying to do what's best for your community, it's not as easy as I'm a good person, therefore everybody's free.
Yeah.
Right. And putting that into historical context, I think was really valuable.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good episode. It's linked in the show notes. Go to parentingporcupines.com and you can go listen to that Thomas Jefferson episode on Words and Numbers. A little shout out to James and Ant for bringing that forward and talking more about the complexity of that, particularly in that era. There's a great interview. I haven't been able to find it again, but before Hamilton, I want to say it was well before Disney Plus Hamilton, right? We were watching a behind the scenes kind of investigation into Hamilton. It showed how they went from being off Broadway and onto Broadway. And one of the things that they had was a Christopher Jackson and Daveed Diggs and a couple of the other actors went and visited Mount Vernon, and they're walking through Mount Vernon thinking about George Washington, and they go through the quarters of the enslaved people there, and they're walking through, they're looking at the tools of the plantation and all of that. And Christopher Jackson has this great sort of soliloquy where he talks about trying to rationalize the behaviors of these men, knowing that what they did, so many things that they did were so great and so important, and so many things they did were so hurtful and painful, right? And it's an awesome sort of exploration of like a person trying to figure out, what do you really say about these folks later on? But I think it's a challenge to think about applying our own current modern day morality to their existence. I don't think that's fair. What do you think, Jessica?
I agree with that 100%. And that's what the conversation that we have in our house is, because actually Caldwell has asked about Thomas Jefferson owning slaves. And part of that conversation came out of Hamilton. And so having to explain that it's sometimes very, it's not a good idea to use your principles in this modern society to say that it was right or wrong at that time, even though we know it was wrong. We know it was wrong now. We would never do it. We would never endorse it. But it's really hard to say that, because at that time that was normal for them. So,
well, and reading. Ooh, sorry, I just jumped in. But you just listen to that Words and Numbers. They're talking about, if you read what Jefferson wrote, he knew it was wrong. He didn't like it, but he didn't see how to change that portion of it. And you know what? People get stuck in systems they don't know how to fix.
Yeah. Okay. Look, that's exactly right.
Yep.
So there are systems that once they get put in place, and we don't necessarily see when we're building them what that repercussion is going to be, what that expanse is going to look like. And then we don't know how to get out of it. And getting out of slavery, getting out of the institution of slavery was a messy, messy thing, right? There were decades of poverty and death and violence after enslaved people had been freed, right? And so we know that once the system, that's a terrible system, it's a hateful system, it's dismantled. And yet there's a government agency called the Freedmen's Bureau, and the Freedmen's Bureau job was to like make sure that all these freed persons now had accesses to the resources that they needed. Yeah, government can fix this, right? Like, you got to know that's just got disaster written all over it, right? You're going to show up in New Orleans because that's your local branch of the Freedmen's
at all.
Can you imagine? Like, now here you are, you're a freed person in, rural Louisiana, and the nearest place.
I'm here to help.
Yes, and the nearest place for you to go for resources is all the way down in New Orleans, and you're just going to walk and take your whole family there, and you're going to show up, and some government person's going to do what for you? Like, how can they help you now? Like, and so all of that, like that super messiness, should have been a warning to us that, like, when our government builds systems, it gets those systems so deeply entrenched that we don't know how to pull back from them. And I think that is the perfect segue to this conversation about education. Because as the rewriting history conversation is out there, and people are, pounding their fists on the table, don't pull down the monuments, we need to tell, these stories. There are some red flags on some of these stories. There's some of these narratives that are inherently troublesome. And so I thought we could take a look at a few of those. Nobody is saying that the three of us are history professors. Here comes the disclaimer again. We're not history professors. We're just suggesting that if you're going to be actively involved in the conversation around what history is being taught in the classroom, you should, at the very least, know what the name of the textbook is that's being used. What are the resources that are being used in your kid's classroom, and find out what the interpretations they're being exposed to are. Okay, so the first one is, and I thought this was really interesting, 3 good wars for freedom. So the Revolutionary War birthed Americans' commitment to liberty. The Civil War extended freedom to enslaved people. And World War II exported American freedom worldwide. So goes the sanitized classroom and Hollywood story, right? But wars that don't fit the freedom narrative, like Korea, Vietnam, the Spanish-American War, let alone all of those, Oklahoma, right? All of these stories of violent clashes of minority groups, those are not put into history because those wars don't fit the good war for freedom narrative. Had you heard that before? These 3 big wars that we talk about, yay, America, and these other wars that we're like, let's not talk about that.
No, I've never heard it said like that, but it is just from having learned American history. Yeah, those are the 3 you learn about.
Yeah.
Over and over and over
the rest
again.
Of them, yeah, the rest of them, you might get a blurb under a picture, LBJ, something, and that's it.
Yeah. One paragraph about Vietnam.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
but
you
spend an
never
entire semester on each of those wars.
Yeah.
And you never really hear much about any of the things that happened with the indigenous people. It's pretty much completely erased.
Yeah, you get a sentence about the Trail of Tears, and that's it.
Yeah, because Western expansion is this glorious thing that American frontiers people did, right? They expanded west. They grew our country. So when I was in my junior year in high school, was right around the Persian Gulf War. It's like 91, 92 timeframe, right? And we studied Vietnam and the Persian Gulf War, the first Iraq War. We studied them in compare and contrast. Our history teacher, he was adamant that we should not have gone into the Persian Gulf. Like, he personally felt that way. And so he drew every single connectivity you could see between our financial and global political interests in Vietnam and our financial and global political interests in that first war in Iraq and the Persian Gulf War. And that's how we studied it. That's how we learned about the Persian Gulf War. We started that very first day of class. We didn't start with World War II. We started with the Persian Gulf War on the very first day.
We're the same age. I don't remember studying the Persian Gulf War in school at all. No one mentioned it.
We read
I don't remember studying that either.
Yeah, we read a book called The Commanders, which was written by, you'll remember their names, Bob Woodward wrote it.
Oh, yeah.
He's the one that asked Deep Throat, exactly. So we read The Commanders, and we talked all about, oh man, I know more about General Schwarzkopf than you. You guys even remember General Schwarzkopf? He was like before, he was like pre-Colin Powell. He was Colin Powell's boss.
Yeah, Storm and Norman.
Yeah.
I remember where I was when they announced we had gone to war.
Mm-hmm.
Like I was in a store, back to school shopping with my mom because it was August.
Right.
And they announced on the radio in the store, whatever radio station we were listening to, hey, we're officially at war in Iraq. Yep. No, I remember that.
Yeah. Our history teacher, it's a good history teacher, Mr. Graney. I'm going to give him a little shout out, Mr. Graney, really good history teacher. And that was what he did. He said, we've been here before. We've seen this before. Let's look at Vietnam and what were the conditions that caused Vietnam? And it was powerful. I remember that to this day, right? I'm 30 years out of high school and I remember that. I'll never forget it. So that's the kind of thing that I think this particular concept, this rewriting history idea, I think that's what it's looking for. It's looking for people to be critical and to look at those things side by side and say, where do we have commonalities here? One of the things that Hamilton did was it mentions the French Revolution a good bit, right? Mm-hmm. We get a little bit of whether or not we're going to get involved, whether the Americans are going to get involved in the French Revolution. And Charlie wrote in the comments before, he said, you mean Les Miserables? He said, you mean Les Miserables is not real? The French Revolution is fake news? I'm like, yes, it's fake news. So
Waterloo happened.
Yeah, exactly. So when we have this idea, though, that the looking side by side, French Revolution, American Revolution, what does that look like? How do you sort of, are the conditions the same? Why did they do what they did? Where were people in their thought process? Like that's a deep dive into a history lesson, as opposed to just like, here are your dates, here are your people, this happened, let's move on.
Yep. That's the best history. This is what he didn't teach any of this. But we had a history teacher in my high school, and we did not have a textbook. There were no tests. There was no homework. There was nothing. Mr. Dyer stood in the front of the class every day. This was junior, senior history. It was Roman history. But he just told stories like he was there. He drew pictures and diagrams, and he doesn't care if you understand the dates and the names and, on October 31st, this guy marched here. Mm-hmm. That's not the point. The point is, this is the conditions. These are what cause and effect. Why did this happen? What effect did it have on the rest of the world? That's the important part of history, not remembering some guy's name and whatever year he did what he did. The important part is understanding cause and effect.
Yeah.
So you don't repeat it, because if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it.
But haven't we systemized our education system to the extent that we have? Yeah, we have these measurements, and people have to pass the test, and the test is all discrete answers, right? It's A, B, C, or D, and how do you give them the information they need to be able to do well on the test?
Well, I think it's really unfortunate because, and I never had an experience with a history teacher like that. Not that I remember. But I think that your stories speak to part of the problem, and that is that teachers, educators are not allowed to teach and educate.
He'd get fired in a hot second today.
I know.
They're not allowed to go outside of this box that has been drawn for them. And so they're not able to spark conversation. They're not able to encourage that deeper level of thought, because it is very much, this is what we're going to teach you. This is what happened. And that's it.
You have to know these names and dates so you can pass the test.
And it results in an indoctrination, right? It results in basically an indoctrination where you're either going to remember it or you're not. But either way, we've checked our boxes and you got out of 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade, and off you go. Yeah. It's a big time failure in a national system. So the next one that was in here too, that are sort of red flags, and I love this one too, is hyper patriotic narratives that focus on American exceptionalism, including depicting America as a land of opportunity for all, praising capitalism, downplaying imperialism, and characterizing protest as misguided, dangerous, or deranged. Are you familiar with hyper patriotic versions of American history?
And I think that the depicting America as a land of opportunity for all, I think, that's good. That was the intent. That's not the reality of what played out. So separating the intent, but in reality, this is what happened.
It's an over optimization, right?
Yes,
like we're totally optimistic about this. Everything's going to be wonderful. And all of a sudden it feels like Reagan is stomping through the door with his just say no signs. Like, just say no and the drugs will go away. Like, this isn't a thing. Like, how do you oversimplify things to the place of Americans are exceptional and the only wonderful things that have ever happened in the history of the world came out of America? And you're like, but we're one of the youngest countries around. Like, how is that possible? We're exceptional. We're amazing. Like, come on. Nobody's saying go into the classroom and bash your country. Holly even said this week that she thinks that her generation is significantly less patriotic than the generations that have come before her. And I told her, I think part of that is that there's a lot of tribalism right now, but part of it too is that they didn't have the one big bad. Like when we were growing up, you had the one big bad. It was the Soviets. Like we were anti-Soviets. As long as you weren't a commie, you were good to go, right? So like everything else we could handle, but the Soviets were like the big bad. And so you could be like, think of the Olympic theme that we hear now was written for the Los Angeles Olympics, right? And it's still being played all these years later. It was meant to be Reagan's big patriotic show, when we had the Olympics in Los Angeles. And I think we grew up on that, but it's not that way anymore. Patriotism isn't necessarily indoctrinated anymore in the same way, or maybe for whatever reason people are seeing. I don't know. I don't know why. I don't know why they're not as patriotic. What do you think?
Well, I think it's mutated because I think there is a place for pure patriotism, right? Like, I love my country. I want my country to be the best that it can be. But I'll also recognize that there are flaws, that there are problems that need to be fixed. And I think that teaching kids that it's okay to ignore the problems that need to be fixed because the country is great. I think that's the difference.
That's the wrong kind of patriot. I want to fix the problems in my country because my country should be great.
But I think we went from that. I think we went from that pure
that's where we're going
to.
I can help make my country greater.
I mean, I think in the 80s,
lucky as hell to live in the United States.
Yeah, right. There's that.
Like, I feel super lucky because there's a lot of places we could have been born that really, really,
absolutely.
So super lucky, and I love my country, but we need to help it be as great for everybody as it can be.
So there's two things that you guys said that really kind of struck me. The first is I think we went from like a hyper optimistic sort of blind patriotism in the 80s, pretending like the bad things weren't out there because we did have the big bad. But then after 9/11, they tried to make the terrorists the big bad, right? Like we tried to bring in a new big bad and it fell apart pretty quickly. Like it just didn't hold up, right? And so there's a whole conversation to be had about like the persistent fear that they've continued to use to try to get us all to be compliant and bow to their authority. But the things that you guys said that made me think, the first was that there's this idea that patriotism is questioning your government, right?
Yeah.
It is about recognizing the flaws. That is patriotic. It is patriotic to say
that's how our country was birthed.
Exactly. It was the whole principle on which our country was founded. Yeah.
So at what point did we decide that people protesting or people, voicing their opinion or people kneeling during the national anthem, at what point did we decide that they don't love their country? Like, how did that become a thing? I don't understand this, this complete backlash against the people who would try to say, like, I want to make things better and say, well, everything's great. Or it could be great again if you'll just shut your mouth and get in line, right? Like, that's not patriotic. Patriotic is to recognize that we have work to do and then want to cooperate to do it, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's a generational clash. I really do. I think the generations of, once again, I love the meme of the boomer and the millennials are screaming at each other and Gen X is in the middle just pouring drinks for Gen Z. Right. It's the best thing I've ever seen. It's the funniest thing because it's accurate, y'all. It's just the generations in charge really don't agree with the next generation coming up, and they're just screaming at each other. Yeah. Y'all, calm down. It's okay.
Well, I think it's really important to note, and something that I tell people anytime the protest conversations come up, is that our country was founded on one.
What do you think the Tea Party was?
Violent, messy protest.
Yep.
And I'm not saying that that's what we should be doing again, but intentionally ignoring that, I think is very dangerous.
And it's disingenuous. Yeah.
Trying to control it. Trying to control it, trying to force a specific narrative, trying to contextualize it, trying to make it seem like this is, we've got everybody's wearing masks, everybody's, we've got our riot gear out there, like all these things that the authoritarians are doing to try to control that protest, that eruption of emotion, I think is just disingenuous. I mean, it's
they just passed new ordinances in Charleston.
Lord
about
have mercy.
Protesting and your permits that you have to exercise your First Amendment, right? And we're all sitting here going, but it's the First Amendment. I need permission from the government to protest the government.
I can't.
All right.
We're going to have a whole episode on the glory of protesting. So let's talk about this last little piece here.
Can we do permits too?
Yeah. Let's talk about this last piece. So I would assume, well, first I'm going to make a guess here, but I don't know if you could agree with me or not, but I assume that we don't agree with the State House climbing up into our history curriculum and figuring out what should and should not be taught.
Absolutely not.
Oh,
absolutely not. Hell no. Back off, State House. We're done with that.
Yeah, get out of my business.
Yeah. And then the second piece is there's a trend in, we've been calling it flipped classroom at the university, where you ask the students to bring in the resources and then everybody shares these resources together. And we talk about what's valid and what's not valid and why does this matter? And it doesn't have to be, out of the Harvard Business Review. It can be out of wherever you found it. And let's talk about whether or not we think it's accurate or not. And so this idea of moving toward a flipped classroom where you allow the students to sort of curate that experience and bring that knowledge in, and then let the teacher be the mediator in these conversations and teach the kids to have these conversations that are sort of bigger, broader than just the dates and the facts. I think that might be an approach. And I know teachers who are doing that even at the 7th and 8th grade level, which is amazing. But it's not an approved curriculum necessarily. It's not an approved approach. And it takes a lot of finesse to know when kids are fully engaged and whether or not they're getting what you need. And of course, it doesn't teach to the test either. So
yeah, but you know what it does teach? It teaches your children critical thinking skills to say, where did I find this information?
We don't do that here.
Giving me this information.
You're talking crazy, Pan.
Yeah.
when you find information, to ask, what is their agenda? What are they what point are they trying to make? And it teaches them how to spot fake news.
Yes.
Which is like the skill you need with the internet.
Lord have mercy, it is. It is probably the most important skill that they need coming out of high school. And if you cannot teach your children how to spot the garbage that is being circulated on the internet, we have a problem, right? That's like parenting fail.
It has to be true.
Parenting fail. Just parenting fail. All right. Anything else we want to say about the founding fathers or this idea of rewriting history? We got through the whole thing without talking about critical race theory, which I'm kind of pleased about, because wow, people lose their shit when they hear that phrase. And most of the people who do,
that's about all I know about it. Is people
that it makes people,
it's like about it.
It's like a bomb. It makes people
what it
crazy.
Actually means, I have not taken the time to actually dive into that yet.
Yeah,
it's so benign. I mean, it really is. Like, it's just another one of those things that somebody got a hold of, blew it up like a balloon, and once it got good and fully inflated, started bouncing it around like a beach ball at a concert, and now everybody's obsessed with it. And it's just dumb. Like, it's just, there's just not any reason for it. Stop hating your neighbors over something you don't even know the definition of.
Well, and here's the thing too. If you are
that concerned, yep.
Then have conversations with your kids, talk to them about it. And here's the thing. Please don't think that I will not tell my children, this is what you need to know for the test. So these are the answers you need to give on the test, but let's talk about the facts, because this is what it actually is. So like, they understand.
I have actually had this conversation with my child.
Yeah. Like, this is what they're teaching you, and this is what you need to do to pass. But that's
this
not
is
right.
what's actually, yep.
But
yeah,
I have had
and so I just have to say, like, if it doesn't work for everybody, then it doesn't work. Period.
Yeah.
And this kind of education does not work for everybody. This standardized in the classroom, out of a textbook, taking your standardized test, measuring kids' potential by their ability to memorize dates and names.
Yeah.
It does not work for everybody, and therefore it does not work for anybody. Yeah. Like, it needs to get chucked. It needs to get completely thrown out.
I'm horrible with dates and names. I can tell you what led to what and why and root causes. I can tell you that all day long. Who did what on what day? I have no clue.
And I don't even know what I did yesterday.
But I'll take you that, and Melissa, I'll take the who did the what, right? And the compare and contrast piece. I can write that for you, right? And I still will have to look up Wikipedia to get the dates and the names, right? So
not Wikipedia. There's some. I know. Use Wikipedia.
Lord, yes.
According to my teachers in high school, that's not a source.
No, it's not. It's not a legitimate source for any number of reasons. But you know what that should tell us is that the internet itself is not a legitimate source for pretty much anything, including parenting advice. So if you've been watching this broadcast expecting some parenting advice, you might just want to rethink that as well.
No, don't rethink that, because we're pretty awesome.
Keep watching, keep commenting, keep sharing.
Again.
Keep subscribing. All right, I think it's time to go. We've gotten into the giggles now. Thank you all so much for being here. Thanks for being part of Parenting Porcupines. We'll be back next week. Then we're going to take a 2-week break. And then we'll be back to wrap up the end of season 3 with 5 weeks in a row. So don't go away. Thank you for liking us, sharing us, commenting, and of course, bringing more people to the table and to the Libertarian Party. We appreciate y'all.